Story 1. Brass Balance and Bureaucracy. The Rise of the Ashanti Gold Weighers. If you had wandered into a bustling Ashanti marketplace in the late 17th or early 18th century, you would have stepped into a world without clocks, without cash registers, and without the neat decimal prices we are used to. The market was not silent, it was filled with the steady murmur of voices, the occasional sharp call from a vendor, and the slow shuffle of goods being shifted from one shaded stall to another. But among the cloth merchants, kola nut sellers, and salt traders, one group of people worked with a precision so quiet and deliberate that they stood apart: the gold weighers. The Ashanti Empire, in what is today southern Ghana, grew not from a sudden military conquest but from the slow accretion of trade, alliances, and the gold that passed through hundreds of skilled hands. Gold dust, not coins, was the currency of the day. Every grain of it mattered. And in the absence of uniform coins, the role of the gold weigher was not simply practical, it was essential. Without them, the entire economy would have slowed to a crawl, as no one could be sure if a trade was fair. The world of gold dust. Gold dust is not like gold coins. It is soft, fine, and infuriatingly easy to misplace. It clings to skin and fabric. It can drift on a breath of wind. In a marketplace, the amount of dust in a small brass box could represent a week's earnings, and the tiniest error in weighing could spark an argument or an accusation of fraud. The gold weighers carried their tools in leather pouches or wooden boxes, delicately cast brass weights, each shaped like miniature sculptures: birds, reptiles, human figures, abstract geometric patterns. These were not merely decorative. Each design corresponded to a specific unit of weight, part of a system that had developed over generations. Alongside the weights were balance scales, simple wooden beams with string pans, so finely made they could register the difference between 2 grains of dust. Their job was straightforward in theory. When a buyer and seller agreed on a price, say, a bolt of cloth for a certain measure of gold dust, the gold weigher would produce the appropriate brass weights, set them on one pan, and pour gold dust into the other until the beam hung perfectly horizontal. In practice, it required absolute concentration, an unshakable hand, and the trust of everyone involved. No standardization, no problem. In Europe at this time, governments minted coins with stamped values, and disputes over weight could be settled by weighing a coin against a master standard stored in a city hall. In the Ashanti market, there was no such central authority, at least not in the beginning. Each gold weigher's weights were slightly different, often reflecting local traditions or the gradual wear of constant handling. This lack of standardization should have led to chaos. Instead, it gave rise to an unspoken system of personal reputation as currency. A gold weigher's livelihood depended entirely on their perceived honesty. If word spread that a man's weights were light, his services would no longer be sought, and his career could collapse in days. On the other hand, if a weigher was known to be precise, even if his weights were technically heavier or lighter than others, people would still trust him, knowing he would apply them consistently. A quiet power. This trust made gold weighers some of the most influential people in the market, though they wielded no obvious authority. They were not kings, chiefs, or warriors, but their control over the measure of wealth gave them subtle influence. Merchants would court their services, offering small gifts, a length of cloth, a measure of kola nuts, in hopes of ensuring priority attention on busy market days. Chiefs relied on their records to settle disputes between traders from different towns. And slowly, without intending to, the gold weighers began to knit the Ashanti trade network together. Because they served both local traders and foreign merchants, Akan-speaking townspeople, Hausa caravan leaders from the north, and European agents from the coast, they became unofficial brokers of information as well as gold. If a merchant from Kumasi learned that a caravan from the Sahel had brought an unusually large load of salt, he probably heard it from a gold weigher who had measured out the dust for that transaction the day before. Tools that told stories. Each brass weight carried a history. Some were cast in the shape of animals associated with proverbs, reminding the user of moral lessons. A crocodile with a fish in its mouth might recall the saying, "The crocodile says he does not eat fish, yet look at his mouth." Others reflected distant trade connections, spirals, and patterns similar to those found in North Africa or even in European decorative arts, carried inland by centuries of commerce. Making a set of weights was itself a specialized craft. Brass casters worked in low, smoky workshops using the lost wax casting method, shaping the weight in beeswax, encasing it in clay, firing it until the wax melted out, then pouring molten brass into the mold. The result was then polished and sometimes inlaid with contrasting metals. To own a full set of weights was to carry not just a tool, but a miniature gallery of art, history, and culture. The market rhythm. A day in the life of a gold weigher moved at a slow, deliberate pace. There was no rush to process transactions. Each weighing was a small ritual. First, the weigher would check his scales, making sure the pans hung evenly. Then he would choose the correct weight or combination of weights, often stacking them together to match the agreed price. Only then would he allow the seller to begin spooning gold dust from a small leather bag or wooden box. The dust was leveled with a thin piece of wood, excess brushed back into the container with a feather. The balance beam would rock gently as the dust settled. The weigher's eyes stayed fixed on the pivot, waiting for the moment when gravity declared the deal fair. If the beam tilted, the seller might add another grain or two. If it dipped toward the weight, the buyer would reclaim a fraction. Only when the beam lay still would the weigher nod and step back. From market stall to imperial backbone. What began as a local necessity, ensuring fair trade, would, over the coming decades, become the backbone of the Ashanti Empire's wealth. As trade expanded, so did the demand for reliable measurement. Gold weighers became so integral that the Ashanti state eventually began to regulate them, introducing official weight standards and punishing fraud severely. Yet in these early years, before the system was formalized, the gold weighers operated in a delicate balance of trust, skill, and quiet authority. Without their patient labor, the Ashanti economy might never have reached the stability needed to grow into an empire. And it is in this slow, almost invisible growth that the accidental empire of the Ashanti gold weighers began to take shape. But the story of how they went from trusted market figures to state-appointed officers, how a quiet profession became an imperial institution, is one worth unfolding in careful detail. The Ashanti state did not spring into existence fully formed. It was assembled, slowly, through alliances, wars, and the gradual recognition that certain kinds of order, especially in trade, benefited everyone involved. And in this emerging network of authority, the gold weighers moved from the shadows of the market into the regulated light of official responsibility. The centralizing vision. In the early 18th century, as the Ashanti kingdom expanded under the leadership of Osei Tutu and his successors, control of resources became more than a matter of wealth, it was a matter of power. The central government recognized that whoever controlled the measurement of gold controlled not just the market but the taxation of trade. Without reliable weighing, taxes could not be assessed fairly, and disputes between towns could fester into political problems. The solution was to formalize the profession of gold weighing. Chiefs and state officials began to appoint trusted individuals as Edwumfo, or official weighers, for major markets. This formalization came with both privileges and responsibilities. An official gold weigher could command higher fees for his services, but he was also subject to strict scrutiny. Fraud was not just a private failing, it was an offense against the state. Standard weights and the first bureaucracy. To support this change, the Ashanti court developed standard reference weights kept under guard. These were not used in daily trade but served as master measures to check and calibrate the weights of appointed gold weighers. In Kumasi, the capital, these reference weights were part of the royal treasury, guarded alongside the state's gold reserves and regalia. This step, creating a standard and enforcing it, was, in its own quiet way, the birth of an Ashanti bureaucracy. The gold weighers became part of a larger administrative machine, alongside tax collectors, record keepers, and court officials. The state began recording not only the appointments of gold weighers, but also the volume of gold passing through their hands, allowing for more precise taxation. Ceremony and accountability. When a new gold weigher was appointed, the process was ceremonial. The appointee would be summoned before the local chief, who would present him with a set of calibrated weights and a balance beam blessed by elders. Witnesses from the market would be present to affirm the man's good character. The ceremony served a dual purpose. It publicly legitimated the weigher's authority and reminded everyone that his work was an extension of the chief's justice. Accountability was equally public. A weigher accused of fraud would face trial before the chief's court, with merchants and traders giving testimony. Punishments varied from fines and the confiscation of weights to banishment from the market, but the shame of losing one's position could be as damaging as any financial penalty. Integration with the wider economy. By the mid-18th century, Ashanti gold was not only traded within the region, but also moved along caravan routes to the north, and by river and road to the European forts along the coast. Here, in dimly lit trading rooms smelling of palm oil and tobacco, the gold weighers encountered foreign merchants Portuguese, Dutch, Danish, and British whose own systems of measurement differed from the Ashantis. Rather than resist, the gold weighers adapted. They learned the equivalence between Ashanti weights and European ounces, ensuring smoother transactions. This adaptation was not only practical, it enhanced their value to the state. A gold weigher who could operate in both systems was indispensable, acting as a bridge between two economic worlds. Weighers as gatekeepers. The more central trade became to the Ashanti state's power, the more the gold weighers became gatekeepers. No significant quantity of gold could leave the market without passing through their balances. This gave them leverage not in the sense of setting prices, but in influencing the pace and direction of trade. Merchants seeking to move large sums of gold might quietly favor certain weighers, hopping for smoother or more favorable transactions. The state, aware of this, rotated weighers between markets and periodically recalled them to Kumasi for inspection. This rotation had the side effect of spreading knowledge and techniques across the empire, further standardizing the profession. The everyday boredom of empire building. It would be easy to imagine this as a glamorous role handling gold daily, interacting with merchants from across West Africa and Europe, but most of the gold weigher's life was made up of small, repetitive actions. Adjusting scales, cleaning pans, checking weights against the standard, recording amounts in neat columns of script if literate, or committing them to memory with mnemonic devices if not. These records mattered more than they appeared to. A week's worth of notes from a single weigher could reveal shifts in the flow of goods, more salt from the north in 1 month, fewer European textiles the next. To a merchant, this was simply the rhythm of business. To the Ashanti state, it was valuable intelligence. Unintended consequences. The formalization of gold weighing had ripple effects. Because the profession now carried state authority, disputes over weight increasingly became disputes with the state itself. A merchant who accused a gold weigher of cheating was, indirectly, accusing the chief of failing to uphold justice. This could strain political alliances, especially in border towns where loyalty to Kumasi was less firm. The profession also created a kind of career ladder for skilled individuals who were not warriors or lineage nobles. A man could begin as an apprentice to a gold weigher, learn the trade, and through proven honesty gain a position that brought steady income, prestige, and access to political circles. In a society where status was often inherited, gold weighing offered a narrow but significant path of social mobility. A system at its peak. By the late 18th century, the Ashanti system of gold weighing had reached its peak in complexity and reach. Standardized weights, official appointments, cross-cultural adaptation, and record-keeping had turned what was once an informal market service into an essential pillar of the empire's economy. Yet, as with many bureaucracies, strength brought rigidity. The same system that ensured fair trade also became a tool for control, taxation, and political leverage. And while it worked smoothly in times of stability, it was vulnerable to the pressures of war, shifting trade routes, and the growing European presence on the coast. It is here at the height of their influence that the gold weighers faced the first signs of change. Not from within the markets they served, but from events far beyond them. The politics of European forts, the rise of rival trading states, and the shifting patterns of demand in the global gold trade. The Ashanti gold weighing system had been built on precision, trust, and the slow accumulation of authority. For decades, it had held the empire's economy together with the quiet, deliberate motion of balance beams and brass weights. But no system, no matter how carefully constructed, exists outside of history's larger currents. By the early 19th century, those currents were shifting in ways the gold weighers could not fully control. Shifting trade winds. The global economy was changing. Gold was still valuable, but the European demand for enslaved people, once a major driver of trade along the Gold Coast, was beginning to collapse under abolitionist pressure. In its place came a rising appetite for palm oil, ivory, and other commodities. These goods could be measured in bulk, without the delicate precision of dust and scales. The gold weighers still had their place, but their centrality to the marketplace began to erode. The Ashanti state, always alert to changes in wealth flows, tried to adapt by directing more trade through Kumasi and keeping gold weighing tightly regulated. But the new commodities often bypassed the traditional market structures, moving directly from interior producers to coastal brokers. In these transactions, the gold weighers' services were unnecessary. The threat from the coast. European influence at the coastal forts also shifted the balance of power. The British, Dutch, and Danish traders began introducing their own coinage, which did not require weighing. Coins were heavier and less flexible than dust as a currency, but they offered a fixed value in dealings with foreigners. Over time, European traders encouraged African merchants to adopt coins for high-value transactions, particularly in trade with the forts. To the gold weighers, this was an existential threat. The art of measuring dust, the tactile skill of balancing pans, the deep cultural knowledge embedded in the weights, all of it became irrelevant when payment came in stamped silver discs. Internal pressures. Meanwhile, the Ashanti Empire itself was facing internal strain. The costs of military campaigns against the Fanti, Denkyira, and other neighboring states were mounting. War disrupted trade routes, and in some cases markets were destroyed entirely. Gold weighers stationed in frontier towns found themselves out of work as merchants fled or caravans diverted elsewhere. Even in the capital, the gold weighers' authority was challenged by corruption within the bureaucracy. Some officials began skimming gold directly from market taxes, undermining the careful trust that the weighing system had cultivated over centuries. A gold weighter accused of collusion with corrupt officials risked not only his job, but also his personal safety. Adaptation and resistance. Not all gold weighers faded quietly. Some adapted by becoming brokers themselves, using their market connections to move into trading rather than measuring. Others specialized in high-value transactions, serving elite clients who still preferred the precision of dust over the bluntness of coins. A few became keepers of tradition, preserving the craft of brass weight-making even as its economic function declined. These men and sometimes women saw themselves as custodians of Ashanti heritage. The weights they produced were no longer for daily market use, but for ceremonial exchange, gifts, and symbols of status. The cultural legacy of the weights. By the late 19th century, the practical role of gold weighing in the Ashanti economy had largely diminished. But the brass weights themselves survived, increasingly valued as cultural artifacts. They found new life as objects of art, collected by both Ashanti elites and foreign visitors. In their intricate shapes, crocodiles, birds, geometric spirals were preserved proverbs, histories, and the memory of a time when wealth was not counted in coins but in grains of shimmering dust. These weights became a kind of historical archive, each piece a silent record of the people who had used it, the markets it had served, and the transactions it had balanced. Even as European colonial powers dismantled Ashanti political authority in the late 19th century, the brass weights endured as emblems of a lost but not forgotten system. From bureaucracy to memory. The British conquest of Kumasi in 1896 and the formal annexation of Ashanti territory in 1901 marked the end of the empire's independent bureaucracy. British administrators replaced gold weighers with colonial clerks and standardized currency. The delicate balances were put away. Coins and paper money now determined value. Yet the gold weigher's legacy persisted in subtler ways. The Ashanti tradition of precise record-keeping, careful measurement, and public accountability in trade did not disappear, it adapted. In the decades that followed, Ashanti merchants became adept in the colonial economic system, bringing with them the habits and disciplines inherited from the gold weighing tradition. A quiet empire remembered. It is tempting to see the gold weigher's empire as having fallen, but this is not quite accurate. It did not collapse in a single event. It faded, as many quiet institutions do, into the background of a new order. Its influence lingered in the expectations of fairness in trade, the ceremonial importance of weights, and the memory of a time when the entire economy balanced literally on the beam of a scale. Today, the brass weights of the Ashanti are scattered across museums, private collections, and family treasuries. To the untrained eye, they are charming curiosities, small bits of metal shaped into animals and symbols. But to those who know their history, they are the remnants of a system that once held an empire together not through force of arms, but through the slow, deliberate, and utterly necessary act of weighing gold dust. And so, the accidental empire of the Ashanti gold weighers came to an end not with a battle or a decree, but with the quiet closing of a balance beam, the settling of dust in a brass pan, and the acceptance that even the most careful systems cannot stand unchanged forever. If the gold weigher's story teaches anything, it is that power can be built not only through conquest or decree, but through patience, trust, and the unglamorous work of daily fairness. Yet it leaves a question hanging in the air. In our own time, which quiet professions unnoticed by most are laying the foundations of tomorrow's empires? Story 2. Mud, Mortar, and Patience. The centuries-long construction of Ely Cathedral. If you were to travel across the low, flat fenlands of eastern England in the year 1080, you would find yourself surrounded by a strange, watery world. The land was neither entirely solid nor entirely water. Channels and ditches wound between stretches of sodden earth. Reed beds swayed in the wind, and the air was heavy with the smell of wet vegetation. In the midst of this landscape rose something unexpected, a hill of solid ground, a natural rise above the marsh. On that rise stood the small but significant settlement of Ely. Ely's location was strategic not because it commanded a major road or trade route, but because it was defensible. Surrounded by fens, it was difficult to approach without local knowledge. For centuries, the site had been home to a religious community, first a modest monastery, then a more substantial abbey founded by St. Etheldreda in the 7th century. By the late 11th century, that abbey was being transformed into something much larger, a cathedral. The Norman vision. The driving force behind this transformation was the Norman conquest of England in 1066. The Normans, newly arrived rulers, set about stamping their authority on the land not only through castles and fortifications, but through monumental churches. These were not simply places of worship, they were statements of power, wealth, and permanence. For Ely, the decision to build a cathedral was both political and spiritual. The site already had a reputation for sanctity thanks to Saint Etheldreda's legacy, and it had resisted Norman control longer than many places, serving as a stronghold for the rebellion led by Hereward the Wake. Converting the abbey into a grand cathedral was a way for the Normans to both honor the saint and demonstrate that Ely now stood firmly within their domain. Building in the fens. Constructing a massive stone building on an island in the middle of a marsh presented problems that were not glamorous but were deeply time-consuming. The first challenge was foundation stability. Stone is heavy, far heavier than the timber structures the fens were used to. Before a single wall could rise, the builders had to ensure the ground could bear the weight. This meant carting in gravel, rubble, and timber piles to create a stable platform. None of this work was visible in the finished building, yet it consumed years of labor. Local men, many of them obligated to provide work through feudal service, hauled materials from surrounding villages. Stone had to come from quarries many miles away, often transported by river where possible, then by ox cart over sodden ground. Stone that traveled. The stone for Ely Cathedral was not local. The fens offered no good building rock. Much of it came from Barnack, a quarry near modern-day Peterborough, famed for its pale limestone. Transporting it required careful timing. In dry months, carts could sometimes cross firmer ground, but in wetter seasons, boats and barges were the only reliable means. The builders developed a rhythm, stockpiling stone in the summer for work that would continue through the winter. Even before the walls began to rise, the work of sorting, shaping, and dressing stone took place. Stonemasons set up temporary yards near the building site, where they cut blocks to size, carved decorative details, and prepared arch stones that would one day span the cathedral's great spaces. The first walls. The earliest sections of Ely Cathedral followed the Romanesque-style massive walls, rounded arches, and small windows. The thickness of the walls was not only a stylistic choice, but a practical necessity. In a damp climate, thick stone helped insulate the interior, and the weight provided stability against the shifting ground beneath. Raising these walls was slow work. Stone had to be hoisted by hand-operated cranes, essentially large treadwheels turned by men walking inside them, much like human-sized hamster wheels. Mortar, made from lime and sand, was mixed on site in large pits. Each course of stone had to be carefully laid, with the mortar allowed to set before more weight was added above. The community effort. Although master masons and skilled artisans were essential, much of the labor came from the surrounding population. Local peasants provided seasonal work, either as part of their feudal duties or in exchange for payment. Women and children also took part, carrying water, mixing mortar, and assisting in the endless task of transporting materials. For the people of Ely, the cathedral's construction was both a burden and a source of pride. It consumed resources, drew taxes, and required constant labor. Yet it also brought trade, visitors, and a sense that their small island was the center of something significant. A building that outlived its builders. By the time the first phase of the cathedral was completed enough to hold regular services, many of those who had started the work were long gone. Medieval construction projects were generational endeavors. A mason might spend his entire working life carving and laying stone for a single building, never seeing its completion. For the Normans who began Ely Cathedral, the goal was not speed but permanence. The building was to stand for centuries, a lasting mark of their rule and their faith. Yet, in the damp, shifting fenland soil, permanence was always relative. Cracks would appear, walls would shift, and repairs would become as much a part of the building's life as its original construction. By the close of the 12th century, Ely Cathedral was a reality, a great stone church rising above the marshes, visible for miles. But its story was far from over. Over the next centuries, it would be expanded, altered, damaged, and repaired. And at the heart of its most famous transformation lay a disaster that no one had planned for. By the early 14th century, Ely Cathedral had stood for over 150 years. It was already a vast and imposing structure, with its Romanesque nave, towering transepts, and central crossing tower. The building dominated the flat fenland landscape, a landmark for travelers and pilgrims alike. But in the year 1322, a disaster struck that would alter its history forever. The central tower's fall. The central crossing tower where the nave and transepts met was one of the most prominent features of the original Norman design. Rising above the rest of the building, it supported a heavy stone spire and gave the cathedral a vertical emphasis visible from many miles away. But over time, the stresses on its foundations increased. The fenland soil, despite the gravel and timber piles driven into it, shifted subtly with changes in water level. Cracks began to appear in the masonry. On a winter's night in February 1322, part of the tower collapsed without warning. The sound must have been tremendous masonry crashing down into the choir, timbers splintering, dust filling the air. In the morning, the damage was clear. The central section of the cathedral was open to the sky, and services could no longer be held in the main space. An opportunity in disaster. For many institutions, such a collapse would have been an unmitigated crisis. But Ely's canons and craftsmen saw it as a chance to remake the cathedral into something even more remarkable. Rather than rebuild the tower exactly as it had been, they conceived of a new structure entirely, an octagon. This design was unprecedented in English cathedral architecture. Instead of a square tower, the central crossing would be spanned by an 8-sided space, rising to a great wooden lantern that would flood the interior with light. The octagon would serve as both a structural solution and a visual centerpiece. Allan of Walsingham's vision. The man credited with this bold plan was Allan of Walsingham, the cathedral's sacrist. In a medieval monastery, the sacrist was responsible for the fabric of the building, its maintenance, decoration, and when needed, its rebuilding. Walsingham was not an architect in the modern sense, but he possessed both the imagination and the practical skill to oversee the octagon's construction. Walsingham's design called for massive timber work to form the frame of the lantern. Oak beams, some more than 60 feet long, were brought from distant forests. Shaping and joining, these beams required master carpenters, who worked high above the cathedral floor on scaffolding that would have made most people dizzy. Engineering on the edge. Building the octagon presented engineering challenges. The existing piers at the crossing had been designed for a square tower, not for the broader, more complex weight distribution of an octagonal structure. Masons had to rebuild and strengthen the lower levels before the timber frame could be raised. The timber itself formed the skeleton of the lantern, but it was sheathed in lead and decorated with carved bosses and tracery. Inside, the octagon opened upward in a graceful sweep, its geometry drawing the eye from the floor to the light streaming down from the lantern windows. The lantern as a symbol. When completed in 1342, the octagon and lantern transformed Ely Cathedral's interior. Sunlight filtered down through the windows at the lantern's base, illuminating the choir and nave in a way no medieval visitor could have expected from such a massive building. At night, candlelight from within would glow faintly through the windows, a beacon across the fens. The lantern became a symbol of Ely itself, distinctive, unique, and a testament to human ingenuity in the face of disaster. Visitors and pilgrims wrote about its beauty, and it became one of the cathedral's defining features. The cost in labor and time. The rebuilding after the collapse took 2 decades of constant work. The costs were immense, requiring contributions from wealthy patrons, income from cathedral lands, and special fundraising appeals to pilgrims. Every stage demanded coordination. Masons carving stone for the piers, carpenters shaping beams, glaziers fitting colored glass into the lantern windows. For the ordinary laborers hauling materials, mixing mortar, raising scaffolding, the work was slow and repetitive. They might spend weeks hoisting beams into place or shaping wedges to fit between stones. Many would never see the project's completion, yet their contribution was essential to its success. A building that remembered its past. Even as the octagon was celebrated, traces of the earlier collapse remained in the cathedral's memory. Carvings and inscriptions commemorated the rebuilding. Some masons discreetly incorporated images of falling towers into the decorative bosses, perhaps as a reminder of the impermanence of even the grandest structures. The octagon's creation marked Ely Cathedral's transition from a purely Norman building into something more eclectic, a fusion of Romanesque solidity and Gothic lightness. It also demonstrated that medieval builders, often imagined as rigid traditionalists, could be daring innovators when circumstances demanded it. By the mid-14th century, Ely stood restored, its octagon a marvel of the age. But the world around it was changing. The Black Death had swept through England in the 1340s, labor shortages had altered the economy, and the cathedral would soon face challenges of a different kind, not from structural collapse, but from shifts in religious life itself. By the time the great octagon and lantern were completed in 1342, Ely Cathedral stood as one of the most distinctive buildings in England. Its airy central space and the glow of light filtering down into the choir impressed pilgrims and dignitaries alike. But architecture is only half the story of any great church. The centuries that followed tested Ely's endurance not through walls collapsing, but through the upheavals of human history. The Black Death and its aftermath. Barely a year after the octagon was finished, the Black Death reached England. The plague struck the Fenlands with the same merciless efficiency it brought to the towns and cities. Monks, craftsmen, and townsfolk died in numbers so great that in some communities, entire households vanished. The impact on the cathedral was immediate. Income from rents and tithes plummeted as tenants died or fields went untilled. Pilgrim traffic slowed dramatically. Travelers feared contagion, and many who might have made the journey to Ely instead stayed close to home. With fewer visitors came fewer offerings at the shrine of St. Etheldreda, one of Ely's key sources of revenue. In the short term, building projects slowed to a crawl. Repairs were postponed, and skilled labor was harder to find. Yet the cathedral endured its very size and permanence, offering a sense of stability in a world turned unpredictable. For the survivors, Ely remained a place to gather, pray, and seek comfort. Late medieval maintenance. Over the next century, the work at Ely shifted from grand construction to maintenance and embellishment. The wooden vaulting of the nave received new paintwork. Choir stalls were carved with intricate misericords, many of them depicting everyday life in the fens. These carvings, fishermen hauling nets, women baking bread, animals in humorous poses, offer a glimpse into the world of ordinary people who sustained the cathedral. Some additions were purely practical. Roofs needed re-leading, windows replaced, and stonework repointed. This was not glamorous work, but it kept the building functional. Cathedral records from the 15th century are filled with small payments to glaziers, carpenters, and laborers for such tasks. These quiet acts of upkeep allowed Ely to survive the centuries intact. The Reformation's shock. The most dramatic change in Ely's long history came not from a physical disaster, but from a political and religious revolution. In the 1530s, King Henry VIII broke from the Roman Catholic Church, dissolving monasteries across England and seizing their wealth. Ely, like other cathedral priories, faced the loss of its monastic community. The shrine of St. Etheldreda, once the beating heart of Ely's spiritual life, was dismantled. Gold, jewels, and reliquaries were carted away. Pilgrimage, long a source of income and devotion, was suppressed. Many of the cathedral's treasures were melted down, sold, or destroyed. Yet Ely was not abandoned. It was refounded as a Church of England cathedral, serving as the seat of a bishop. While the monastic rhythm of life was gone, the building remained in use for worship, now adapted to Protestant forms of service. Survival in a changing world. The post-Reformation centuries brought both neglect and care in turn. Some parts of the cathedral fell into disrepair, especially during periods of political turmoil like the English Civil War, when soldiers were quartered inside and furnishings were damaged. Yet at other times, renewed interest in the building led to restorations. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, changing attitudes toward medieval architecture once seen as outdated sparked campaigns to preserve and repair the cathedral. Stonework was replaced, roofs reinforced, and stained glass restored or recreated. These efforts, though sometimes heavy-handed by modern conservation standards, ensured the structure's survival into the modern era. A living landmark. Today, Ely Cathedral still dominates the Fenland skyline much as it did in the 12th century. The octagon remains its most celebrated feature, a reminder of the ingenuity that turned disaster into beauty. But equally important is the quieter story, that of generations who patched roofs, mended windows, cleaned gutters, and kept the structure sound through war, plague, and religious upheaval. If you visit now, you might see the grandeur first: the soaring arches, the light from the lantern, the vast sweep of the nave. But beneath that grandeur is the slow, patient work of countless anonymous hands, each performing tasks that in their time seemed small, but together allowed the building to endure for nearly 1,000 years. The story of Ely Cathedral's survival offers a reminder that endurance often comes not from grand gestures but from unremarkable persistence. Still, it leaves one to wonder, of the buildings we raise today, which will still stand, quiet and steadfast, 7 centuries from now, and what uncelebrated labor will have kept them there. Story 3. Salt for the Sultan Caravan Logistics in the Sahara. If you were to walk into the heart of the Sahara in the 15th century, you might expect to find nothing but sand and silence. But in certain seasons, that silence would break with the slow, rhythmic bells of camels, the murmur of traders, and the creak of leather harnesses. This was the sound of the salt caravan's long trains of men and camels moving slowly across the desert, carrying slabs of white crystal that were worth their weight in gold. To the cities of the Sahel and the Savannah Timbuktu, Kano salt was not a luxury, but a necessity. In the hot climate, it preserved food, replaced what the body lost through sweat, and served as a form of currency. The demand was so steady and so high that entire trade networks existed solely to bring it from the mines deep in the Sahara to the markets far to the south. The salt mines of Tayudeni. One of the most famous sources of this precious commodity was Tayudeni, in what is now northern Mali. Here, in a place where summer heat could kill a man by midday, miners dug into ancient salt deposits, cutting the mineral into rectangular slabs. The work was brutal. Men labored with simple tools: picks, chisels, wooden wedges to break the salt free. Each slab weighed roughly 30 to 40 kilograms. The miners themselves were often prisoners or men bound by obligation to local chiefs. Food and water had to be brought to them from far away, as the mines produced nothing but salt and dust. Once cut, the slabs were stacked, ready for the next caravan north or south. Camels as freight engines. The camel, specifically the dromedary, was the beating heart of the salt trade. Able to carry 150 to 200 kilograms, survive for days without water, and tolerate searing heat, the camel transformed the Sahara from a barrier into a vast but navigable highway. Each caravan could number from 100 to more than 1,000 camels. They were loaded in the early morning before the desert sun reached its peak. A single camel might carry 3 to 4 slabs of salt, tied with rope or leather straps. The load had to be balanced carefully: too much weight on one side, and the camel could stumble and injure itself, which in the desert could mean death for both beast and owner. The route south. From Tayudeni, the caravans headed toward major trade hubs in the Sahel, often taking 2 to 3 weeks to reach their destinations. Travel was slow, 20 to 25 kilometers per day, dictated by the pace of the camels and the availability of water at known wells or oases. These stops were vital. At each one, the caravan would rest, refill water skins, and allow camels to feed on sparse desert vegetation or eat fodder brought along. Navigation was handled by Tuareg guides, whose knowledge of landmarks, wind patterns, and star positions was essential. In the featureless desert, a wrong turn could lead to disaster. These guides were paid well for their skill, often in salt itself. Salt as currency. In the markets of Timbuktu or Gao, the slabs of salt were stacked in neat piles and sold by traders who specialized in the commodity. Prices fluctuated seasonally and geographically. In the desert's edge towns, a slab might be worth a modest amount, but further south where salt was scarce it could fetch many times that price. Salt could even function as money. In rural markets, a slab might be broken into smaller pieces for everyday transactions. For certain communities, salt was more reliable than coins, whose value could be debased or whose availability depended on the whims of distant rulers. The Sultan's share. Salt caravans were not entirely free enterprises. Local rulers, from desert chiefs to the sultans of great empires like Mali and Songhai, taxed the trade heavily. This could take the form of tolls at specific points, fees for safe passage, or direct seizure of part of the cargo. In return, they provided protection from bandits and rival caravans, though protection could sometimes feel indistinguishable from extortion. The sultans understood salt's strategic value. Controlling its flow meant controlling both wealth and loyalty. In times of war or political unrest, salt supplies could be diverted, cut off, or flooded into markets to influence prices. The quiet work behind the journey. The glamour of the salt trade, such as it was, belonged to the scale of the caravans and the exoticism of their routes. But the reality was slower, harsher, and filled with mundane logistics. Water skins had to be inspected for leaks. Camels needed to be shod with protective leather for rocky stretches. Food for the men, often dates, millet cakes, or dried meat, had to be rationed precisely. Most of the caravan's time was spent in silence, the monotony broken only by the occasional rest stop or the unexpected sight of another caravan moving in the opposite direction. Traders dozed in the saddle, lulled by the steady sway of the camels and the endless horizon. By the time a caravan reached its destination, many weeks after departure, the slabs of salt would already have changed in value, sometimes making fortunes, sometimes barely covering the cost of the journey. But the trade endured century after century, its rhythm as steady as the camel's gait. Yet the story of the salt caravans is not only about the journey, it is also about the delicate network of markets, taxes, and seasonal cycles that kept them running. And that network, while resilient, was always at the mercy of shifting politics and the vast, indifferent desert. When a salt caravan arrived at the southern edge of the Sahara, the journey was only half finished. The slow, deliberate weeks of travel through the desert gave way to the bustling, layered complexity of the Sahelian market cities. Here, slabs of salt met a world of merchants, middlemen, and political officials, each with a role in turning the white crystal into wealth. The market at Timbuktu. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Timbuktu was one of the most important trading hubs in West Africa. To travelers, its name carried the allure of distant riches. To caravan leaders, it meant a place where salt could be turned into gold, grain, cloth, and more. The salt market operated in open squares or shaded arcades. Slabs from the desert were stacked neatly, sometimes taller than a man, their flat surfaces marked with the pick strokes from Tayudani's mines. Buyers ranged from local shopkeepers to agents for distant towns, each looking to purchase in bulk or small quantities depending on their needs. Prices were not fixed. Bargaining was expected and could last for hours. A single slab might change hands multiple times before leaving the market, each trader taking a modest profit. The most skilled merchants knew when to sell immediately and when to hold onto their stock for a more favorable season. The gold connection. The most famous exchange was salt for gold. Merchants from the forest zones to the south, where gold was mined, traveled north to trade dust and nuggets for salt. The value of gold was high everywhere, but in the forest regions salt could be even more prized, as it was difficult to obtain without long trade routes. This salt-gold trade was not conducted directly in most cases. Instead, it moved through layers of intermediaries. A merchant from Timbuktu might sell salt to a trader from Jen, who in turn sold it further south. Gold would filter back up the same chain. Each step added cost, but also spread wealth widely across the trade network. Taxes and tolls. No caravan entered a major city without passing through the tax checkpoints of the local ruler. In Timbuktu, under the Mali Empire, and later the Songhai Empire, tolls were collected at the city gates. These could be levied per camel load, per slab, or as a percentage of the cargo's estimated value. In addition to official taxes, caravan leaders often paid gifts to local officials to ensure smooth passage and favorable market placement. While these payments could be seen as corruption, they also served as an informal insurance system helping to secure storage space, guards for valuable goods, or early access to wealthy buyers. Storage and security. Salt was durable but not immune to damage. If left in damp conditions, it could soften and lose weight, effectively reducing its value. Merchants rented storage rooms or shaded stalls to protect their stock while negotiating sales. Guards, often armed with spears or swords, were hired to deter theft. Though outright robbery inside market walls was rare, a missing slab represented a significant loss. For caravans planning to return north, some salt was held in reserve as return cargo. This could be sold in desert settlements or exchanged for supplies at oases. The decision of how much to sell and how much to carry back was part of the caravan master's skill. Seasonal rhythms. The salt trade followed the seasons. Caravans moved most often in the cooler months, when daytime temperatures in the desert were less deadly. The timing also aligned with agricultural cycles in the Sahel. Farmers, free from the demands of planting or harvest, could engage in trade or labor as porters. In the markets, prices fluctuated with these rhythms. At the end of a caravan season, when salt was plentiful, prices dropped. Months later, when stocks were low, prices rose sharply. Experienced traders used this cycle to their advantage, buying when supplies were high and selling when scarcity set in. Merchants as diplomats. Because salt caravans linked regions with very different cultures, languages, and political systems, merchants often acted as informal diplomats. They carried news as well as goods, reports of droughts, wars, or the rise of new rulers. Rulers valued these traders as sources of intelligence, and sometimes sought their advice on dealing with distant allies or enemies. Trust, as in many long-distance trades, was the foundation of the system. Merchant families cultivated reputations over generations, and disputes were often settled within trading networks rather than through formal courts. A merchant known to cheat on the weight of salt would find his market shrinking rapidly. By the time the last slab was sold, the caravan's role in the trade seemed complete. But the system that sustained it depended on more than just profit. It relied on a balance between rulers, merchants, and the vast distances of the desert. That balance, while resilient, was never immune to the pressures of change. For centuries, the camel caravans of the Sahara moved with a rhythm as steady as the trade winds. The routes between the salt mines of the north and the markets of the south had shaped empires, sustained cities, and built fortunes slab by slab. But no trade network exists in isolation, and by the 19th century, the forces that had once enriched the salt trade were beginning to unravel it. Shifting political sands. The decline began not with a single event, but with a slow series of changes in political geography. The great empires that had protected and taxed the caravans, the Mali and Songhai, were long gone. In their place rose smaller kingdoms, confederations, and city-states, each with its own tolls, alliances, and disputes. For caravan leaders, this meant that a journey once taxed at 2 or 3 key points might now require payments at a dozen. The more tolls there were, the less profitable the trade became. Some routes became dangerous as rival states fought, and the protection once offered by strong central powers disappeared. Changing tastes and economies. Salt remained essential for preserving food and sustaining health, but the rise of new trade goods, cloth, firearms, manufactured items shifted the focus of many caravans. In some cases, salt became a secondary cargo, carried alongside these newer, more profitable goods. In the coastal cities under growing European influence, imported salt from the Atlantic began to appear. Shipped in bulk, it was sometimes cheaper than desert salt, even accounting for transport inland. This undercut prices in the traditional markets, especially for lower quality slabs. Colonial interference. By the late 19th century, European colonial powers had begun to redraw the map of West Africa to suit their own ambitions. The French pushed deep into the Sahara from the north, while the British advanced from the coast. Colonial administrations, in their drive to control trade and movement, often disrupted traditional caravan routes. Some colonial officers saw the salt caravans as outdated and inefficient, preferring to move goods along new roads built for carts and, eventually, motor vehicles. Others taxed the trade heavily or imposed regulations on movement, making the old seasonal journeys increasingly unworkable. The arrival of the steamship. The camel had ruled the desert for over a millennium, but in the long run, it could not compete with steamships and railways. Salt shipped from Europe or the Mediterranean could reach West African ports in weeks, and colonial transport networks carried it inland far faster than a camel caravan ever could. For the desert miners and caravanners, this was a slow catastrophe. Demand for Saharan salt shrank, and with it, the economic justification for the long, perilous journeys. Entire communities that had depended on the trade for generations saw their livelihoods vanish. Adaptation and memory. Not all the knowledge of the caravan routes vanished with the trade. Some Tuareg and Arab guides turned their expertise to leading expeditions, serving colonial forces, or guiding explorers and surveyors. Others shifted to smaller-scale local trade, carrying goods between oases and nearby towns. In some places, the salt caravans continued into the 20th century, though smaller and less frequent. Even today, in parts of Mali and Niger, seasonal salt caravans still make the journey, more as a cultural tradition than an economic necessity. The legacy of the salt roads. The salt slabs of Tau-Udeni, once as valuable as gold in the southern markets, now hold a different kind of worth as symbols of resilience, endurance, and the deep interconnectedness of African trade. They remind us that long before the age of steam and colonial borders, the Sahara was not an empty wasteland, but a network of highways maintained by human skill, trust, and patience. The white roads across the desert may have faded from economic maps, but in oral histories, proverbs, and the worn memories of camel paths, they remain. For the descendants of the caravanners, the sound of camel bells in the cool morning air is still a reminder of a time when salt built cities, crowned sultans, and bound the desert to the savannah. The salt trade's slow fatting leaves us with a question that reaches beyond the Sahara. When the infrastructure of a society shifts, whether from caravans to steamships, or from markets to digital networks, what skills, trades, and quiet professions will slip into history, remembered only by those who once walked their long roads. Story 4. 1000 Stitches, the Tailors Guild of 14th Century London. If you walked through the narrow streets of 14th-century London, you would hear the city long before you saw it. The clatter of carts on cobblestones, the calls of vendors hawking eels and apples, the smell of tallow smoke and fish markets mingling in the air. Tucked among the bakers, fishmongers, and smiths were the tailors, men and women whose livelihoods depended on needles, shears, and endless patience. To most passers-by, a tailor's work was ordinary. There were no roaring furnaces or hammering anvils, no drama of battle or political intrigue. Yet the Tailors' Guild of London, formerly the Worshipful Company of Merchant Tailors, was a quiet force in the city's economy, shaping everything from clothing trends to trade regulations. Guilds as urban foundations. In medieval London, guilds were more than trade associations. They were part labor union, part business network, part social club, and part religious fraternity. A guild controlled who could work in a trade, how goods were made, and at what price they could be sold. For tailors, the guild also enforced quality standards. Poorly sewn seams or dishonest use of cheap cloth could lead to fines or expulsion. Membership was not automatic. A young person, often a boy, sometimes a girl, entered the trade as an apprentice, bound by a legal contract to a master tailor for a set number of years, usually 7. During this time, they received board, basic clothing, and training, but no wages. In exchange, they learned the skills of measuring, cutting, and sewing, as well as the subtler arts of dealing with clients and negotiating prices. The tools of the trade. The tailor's workshop was a place of quiet concentration. On a sturdy wooden table lay lengths of wool, linen, or silk. Shears, heavy, iron, and designed to be used on a flat surface, were kept razor sharp. Needles were expensive, imported from places like Nuremberg, and had to be cared for diligently. Pins, made of brass or iron, were stored in small cloth rolls to keep them from rusting. Tailors worked by daylight whenever possible. Candles were costly and their light too dim for fine stitching. In winter, the short days meant fewer hours for sewing. In summer, the long daylight allowed work to continue into the evening. Patterns were cut from parchment or heavy cloth, used and reused for years. Cloth as currency. In an age before ready-made garments, fabric was the real luxury. The guild regulated not only who could sew garments but also who could sell certain kinds of cloth. Imported silks from Italy or fine woolens from Flanders were expensive enough to rival property in value. Tailors were trusted to handle these materials without waste or theft. For wealthy clients, merchants, nobles, officials, a tailor's work was about more than fitting clothes. It was about status. The width of a sleeve, the length of a tunic, the choice of colors could signal wealth or political allegiance. Certain fabrics and styles were even restricted by sumptuary laws, which dictated what different social classes could wear. The workshop hierarchy. A master tailor rarely worked alone. In addition to apprentices, he might employ journeymen, fully trained tailors who worked for wages but had not yet saved enough to open their own shops. Journeymen moved between masters as work demanded, carrying their own shears, needles, and sometimes even their own stools. The workshop was both a workplace and a small school. Apprentices were corrected sharply if their stitching was uneven or if they cut too much fabric from a valuable bolt. Mistakes meant wasted material, which could cost more than a week's wages to replace. The guild hall and mutual aid. The Tailors' Guild had its own meeting place, the guild hall, where members gathered to discuss trade matters, settle disputes, and arrange charitable works. The guild acted as a safety net. If a member fell ill, the guild could provide food or help pay for medical care. Widows of guild members could receive support, and orphans of tailors might be taken as apprentices. Guild members also took part in public life, marching in processions, sponsoring religious festivals, and contributing to the upkeep of churches. Their visibility in civic events reinforced their importance in the city, even if most of their daily work took place quietly at the workbench. The rhythm of orders. A tailor's year was shaped by the ebb and flow of orders. In spring, people prepared lighter garments for the warmer months. Late summer and autumn brought work on heavier cloaks and lined tunics for winter. Special commissions came before major festivals or weddings, when wealthy families might order entire sets of new clothing for their households. In quieter times, tailors might work on repairing old garments, letting out seams for growing children, or reusing valuable fabric from worn clothing to make new pieces. Nothing was wasted. Even the smallest scraps could be used for linings, children's clothes, or patchwork. By the mid-14th century, the Tailors' Guild of London was firmly entrenched, its influence reaching from humble parish streets to the halls of the wealthy. But as the century wore on, events beyond the workshop walls, plagues, economic shifts, and changes in fashion would test the Guild's stability and force it to adapt in ways its founders could never have imagined. The mid-14th century brought a series of upheavals that rippled through every trade in London, and the tailors were no exception. While a needle and thread might seem far removed from the great dramas of plague and politics, the events of these decades reshaped how the Tailors' Guild worked, who it served, and even the garments themselves. The Black Death arrives. In 1348, the Black Death reached London. The plague moved quickly, killing thousands in a matter of months. Whole households vanished, workshops stood empty, and the city streets became quieter than anyone could remember. For the tailors, the immediate effect was devastating. Clients died, apprentices were lost, and the demand for luxury garments plummeted. But as with many trades, the aftermath brought unexpected shifts. The loss of so much of the population created labor shortages. Surviving tailors, particularly skilled journeymen, found they could command higher wages or better conditions. Some even left their masters to set up shops of their own earlier than guild tradition would normally allow. A rising middle market. The plague also altered the social landscape. With so many deaths, property and wealth changed hands rapidly. Families who had never counted themselves among London's wealthy suddenly inherited houses, land, or ready coin. This newly enriched middle class became an eager market for clothing that signaled their improved status. Tailors adapted quickly, offering garments in styles once reserved for higher ranks but now made in less costly fabrics. A man might order a tunic in the cut worn by nobles but sewn in sturdy wool rather than imported silk. For the guild, this expansion of clientele meant more work, but also new challenges in enforcing quality standards. Sumptuary laws and social boundaries. The city's authorities and the crown responded to these social shifts with sumptuary laws regulations that controlled what people of different ranks could wear. The laws specified the fabrics, colors, and trimmings permitted to each class. A merchant's wife might be forbidden to wear ermine. A tradesman might be restricted from certain shades of deep crimson reserved for the aristocracy. For tailors, these laws were both a constraint and a source of business. They had to know the rules well enough to avoid embroiling clients in legal trouble, but they also found ways to work creatively within them, substituting similar but legal trims, or using clever cuts to imitate the appearance of more expensive fabrics. Shifting fashions. The 14th century saw notable changes in European fashion, moving away from the loose, flowing garments of earlier medieval dress toward more fitted silhouettes. This trend required greater skill from tailors, as it demanded careful cutting, shaping, and the use of more complex sewing techniques. The development of the gore, a triangular piece of fabric inserted into garments, allowed tunics and gowns to flare elegantly without wasting cloth. Meanwhile, tighter sleeves and laced openings became fashionable, requiring precise measurements and sewing. Fashion also began to change more rapidly, especially in urban centers like London. For tailors, this meant a steady flow of repeat business from clients eager to keep up with the latest cuts, even if it meant replacing garments that were still perfectly serviceable. Cloth prices and the guild's role. Cloth remained the single most expensive part of any garment. England produced high-quality wool, much of it exported to Flanders for finishing before being re-imported as luxury cloth. This trade meant that prices could fluctuate based on foreign politics, war, or harvest failures that affected sheep herds. The Tailors Guild worked to maintain stability for its members by negotiating with cloth merchants, setting standard rates for work, and sometimes stockpiling certain fabrics. Guild records from the later 14th century show fines for tailors who undercut agreed prices or who used inferior materials without the client's consent. Charity and reputation. In a city still haunted by memories of plague, charitable works became a visible part of the guild's identity. The tailors organized almsgiving for the poor, provided clothing for orphans, and contributed to the repair of churches. These acts were not purely altruistic, they reinforced the guild's public reputation, fostering goodwill that could prove useful in disputes with city authorities. A master tailor's standing in the community depended not only on his craftsmanship, but also on his generosity. Well-known masters might have their names recorded in church rolls or mentioned in wills as trusted executors. By the end of the century, the Tailors Guild had weathered the disruptions of plague and shifting fashion. Its members had adapted to new markets, navigated restrictive laws, and maintained their role in London's urban fabric. Yet bigger changes still lay ahead: political unrest, economic competition, and the slow emergence of mass production would test the Guild's ability to keep its careful balance of craft and control. By the dawn of the 15th century, the Tailors Guild had survived plague, shifting fashions, and the restless ambitions of a newly enriched middle class. Yet the decades ahead would bring a different set of challenges, less about the needle's work, and more about politics, competition, and the slow, almost invisible march toward a new kind of economy. The city in turmoil. London in the early 1400s was not a tranquil place. The peasants' revolt of 1381 had left deep marks on the city's governance, and tensions between trade guilds, the crown, and the civic authorities simmered for years afterward. The Tailors Guild, by then formally one of the great 12 livery companies, had to tread carefully. Guild leaders sat on city councils and had influence in civic elections, but that influence could also make them targets when unrest flared. During periods of political instability, tailors often felt the effects indirectly. If noble patrons lost power or fell into debt, commissions for fine garments dried up. Military campaigns could disrupt the wool trade, raising cloth prices and making customers more cautious about ordering costly clothing. Rivalries within and without. Even within the tailoring trade, competition was fierce. There were tensions between the merchant tailors, who handled high-end, custom garments, and other clothworking guilds such as the drapers, cloth merchants, and the haberdashers, dealers in small sewing goods and accessories. Disputes over who could sell certain fabrics or trims could drag on for years, sometimes ending in arbitration before the mayor's court. Outside the guild, unauthorized tailors, sometimes called foreigners, if they were from outside the city, operated without membership or oversight. The guild viewed them as threats to both standards and profits. Periodic inspections by guild officers sought to root out unlicensed work, confiscating goods or fining offenders. For the customers, these unregulated tailors might offer cheaper prices, but at the risk of inferior quality. The workshop as a family. For many master tailors, the workshop was not just a business but a household. Apprentices often lived with their masters, sharing meals and, in some cases, sleeping in the workroom itself. Journeymen came and went with the ebb and flow of orders, but apprentices were long-term investments, young people molded into skilled craftsmen over years of training. This arrangement meant that personal discipline and craft discipline were deeply intertwined. Laziness, drunkenness, or dishonesty could result in dismissal, which carried social stigma and made it harder to find another place in the trade. Fashion's expanding complexity. The 15th century saw a continued shift toward more complex garments. Men's doublets became shorter and more fitted, with padded shoulders. Women's gowns featured elaborate sleeves and carefully tailored bodices. Decorative elements such as slashing, small cuts revealing contrasting fabric beneath, and applied trims demanded greater precision. Tailors needed to stay current not only with the cuts themselves, but also with fitting techniques, understanding how to shape garments to flatter the human form. This skill was part science, part art, and it was one of the guild's guarded advantages over unlicensed workers. Guild power in public life. The Tailors Guild maintained its position through visibility. Members marched in civic pageants in livery robes, carried banners bearing the guild's arms, and funded public works. The guild also continued its charitable work, supporting almshouses for aged members and providing dowries for the daughters of poor tailors. This blending of public generosity and private regulation helped keep the guild in good standing with the city's rulers, even as competition grew. The guild's records from this period read like a ledger of civic engagement: loans to the city, contributions to bridge repairs, gifts of candles to churches. The quiet arrival of chain. While the 15th century did not yet see industrial textile production, subtle changes hinted at what was to come. Improvements in shearing and carding wool, along with more efficient looms, meant cloth could be produced faster. This did not immediately reduce demand for skilled tailoring, but it began to alter the balance between material cost and labor cost. Some guild members worried that if cloth became cheap enough, customers might replace garments more frequently and expect faster, less painstaking work. Others saw opportunity in this shift. More orders meant more business, even if each garment was less of a luxury investment. A craft that endured. By the end of the 15th century, the Tailors Guild had not only survived but strengthened its position. It remained one of London's most prestigious livery companies, its members respected for their skill and its leaders influential in civic politics. The craft itself had changed. Cuts were sharper, fashions more complex, but the essential rhythms of measuring, cutting, and stitching continued. The guild's endurance lay in its ability to adapt quietly, without losing sight of its roots. The same shears, needles, and patterns that had guided tailors through the 1300s were still in use, even as the city around them began to hum with the first faint stirrings of the modern age. The tailor's story reminds us that not all historical change is dramatic. Some professions rooted in patience, precision, and daily repetition persist by adjusting to the world in small, steady increments. And it invites the question, which of today's quiet trades will still be shaping our lives centuries from now, their influence woven into the fabric of our future? Story 5. Counting Cows: The Administrative Life of a Mesopotamian Scribe. If you were to stand in the courtyard of a temple complex in southern Mesopotamia around 2100 BCE, you would see more than priests and worshippers. You would also see a steady stream of herders, merchants, and laborers arriving with livestock, baskets of grain, jars of oil, and all of them would pass through the hands of a man with a reed stylus and a pile of clay tablets, the scribe. In ancient Sumer and Akkad, the scribe was both bookkeeper and bureaucrat. His work rarely involved grand decrees or royal proclamations. Instead, it revolved around recording quantities: how many sheep entered the pen, how many jars of beer were issued to workers, how many oxen were sent to plow the fields. In an economy without paper, without coins, and without centralized banks, the scribe's clay records were the very foundation of administration. The temple as an economic hub. In many Mesopotamian cities, the temple was more than a religious center, it was the heart of the local economy. Temples owned fields, herds, workshops, and storehouses. The offerings brought by worshippers were just one small part of the goods that flowed through their gates. Most of the trade and storage was tied to the temple's role as a landowner and employer. This made the scribe indispensable. Without his careful records, the temple could not track what it owned, what it owed, and what it expected to receive. Livestock was particularly valuable, not only for meat but also for milk, hides, and as draft animals. Cows, sheep, and goats represented wealth that needed to be counted, tracked, and managed. The clay tablet as ledger. The scribe's main tool was a lump of clay, soft enough to be impressed with the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform script. With his reed stylus, he would make quick, precise strokes vertical, horizontal, and angled that formed signs representing numbers, goods, and names. A typical cattle record might note: month of barley harvest from the herd of Enlil's temple, 5 oxen to the plow, 12 cows to the dairy, 3 bulls for sacrifice. These details were not poetic, but they were essential for the temple's stewards to manage resources. Once written, the clay tablets were dried in the sun or baked in a kiln for permanent storage. Important records might be sealed in clay envelopes, with the summary of contents written on the outside. This allowed for later verification if disputes arose. Counting in base 60. Mesopotamian scribes used a sexagesimal base 60 number system, the same one that still shapes how we measure time and angles today. This system was highly flexible for fractions, which made it ideal for trade and rationing. A scribe might need to calculate how to distribute a certain amount of barley among a specific number of workers, or determine the grazing land required per head of cattle. While this number system seems abstract now, to the scribe it was a daily practical skill used to balance tallies and ensure that resources matched the temple's plans. Training for the work. Becoming a scribe required years of schooling in the Adaba, or tablet house. Young boys, and rarely girls, learned first by copying lists of words and signs, then by practicing numbers and basic calculations. Eventually, they would be trusted with simple transactions before advancing to more complex accounts. An experienced scribe was a valuable asset to the temple or palace. His skills could earn him a secure position, regular rations, and social status above that of most laborers. But it was not glamorous work. Most of his day was spent seated, carefully inscribing tablets while the world outside went on with its business. The daily process. When herders brought cattle to the temple, the scribe would stand by the pen with his stylus ready. Each animal would be inspected for age, condition, and purpose. A cow meant for dairy might be marked separately from one destined for sacrifice. The scribe would record these distinctions along with the owner's or overseer's name. Sometimes disputes arose over missing animals, over ownership, or over the condition of stock. In such cases, the scribe's record was the final word. A well-kept ledger could protect an honest herder or expose one who had been skimming from the herd. A network of records. The scribe's clay tablets did not exist in isolation. They were part of a network of archives that stretched across the city. One set might remain in the temple storehouse, another in the palace records, and still others with individual merchants or officials. This redundancy ensured that no single fire, flood, or theft could erase the record of debts and holdings. By the end of a working day, the scribe might have recorded dozens of transactions, each one small, each one dull to an outsider, but together forming the backbone of the city's economy. And in a world without paper or coinage, these clay marks determine the flow of goods, the resolution of disputes, and the very definition of wealth. The Mesopotamian scribe's clay tablet may have looked like a simple object, but it often represented an intricate web of obligations, expectations, and politics. A single tally of livestock might connect the temple's herds to the palace's feasts, to the wages of workers, and even to the credit accounts of private merchants. The scribe stood at the crossroads of these worlds, responsible for keeping their flows of goods in balance. The palace demands. In a Mesopotamian city-state like Ur or Lagash, the palace was not merely a royal residence, it was a major economic power. The king and his court expected a constant supply of goods: grain, oil, beer, meat, textiles, and of course livestock. When the palace hosted feasts, held religious festivals, or received foreign dignitaries, the scale of consumption could be enormous. Scribes stationed at the palace gates or in the royal storehouses kept careful records of what came in and what went out. A temple might be required to send a set number of cattle for a festival, and it was the scribe's job to confirm that the delivery matched the order. In return, the palace might send gifts or payments, often in the form of silver or more goods, which the scribe also recorded. The temple's authority. While the palace wielded political power, the temple claimed divine authority, and that authority translated into economic weight. Temples owned vast tracts of grazing land, operated dairy facilities, and managed herds that could number in the thousands. The livestock under temple control fed workers, supplied sacrifices, and provided goods for trade. The temple scribes were loyal first to the temple administration, but they could not ignore palace demands. Often, the same scribes were required to keep two sets of accounts, one for the temple's internal records, and another for what was reported to the palace. Discrepancies could be intentional or simply the result of different counting methods, but they could also become political flashpoints if one side accused the other of dishonesty. Private merchants and the edges of the system. Alongside temple and palace economies, private trade flourished. Merchants might contract with herders to supply cattle or dairy products to the market, and they too relied on scribes to document their transactions. In some cases, temple scribes moonlighted for private clients, lending their skills in exchange for payment or favors. This blurred the lines of loyalty. A scribe who kept accounts for both the temple and a merchant could find himself in a delicate position if disputes arose between them. Yet his role as a record keeper often made him one of the few people trusted by both sides. Credit and obligation. The Mesopotamian economy operated heavily on credit. A merchant might take a loan of cattle from the temple herd, promising to return an agreed number at the end of the grazing season. If the merchant's cattle produced calves, the temple might claim a share. If disease struck the herd, the debt still had to be settled unless the merchant could negotiate an exemption. All of this required precise records. A single missing tablet could spark months of argument. Scribes developed careful habits for storing and cross-referencing their accounts, sometimes even making duplicate tablets to be kept by different parties. The act of sealing a tablet with a personal cylinder seal was as binding as a modern legal signature. Managing disputes. Disputes over livestock could involve anything from accusations of theft to disagreements over breeding rights. In such cases, scribes often served as witnesses and expert interpreters of the records. A scribe might be summoned before a council of elders, asked to produce a tablet from years past, and to read aloud the details of a transaction. Because clay tablets could last for centuries if properly stored, an old record might still be intact and legible decades after the original deal was struck. This archival memory gave scribes a certain quiet authority. Few others could speak with such precision about the past. Seasonal rhythms. The scribes' busiest times often coincided with agricultural and herding cycles. At the start of the grazing season, herds were counted and assigned to pastures. Mid-season, records were kept of animals sent for market or slaughter. At the end of the season, final tallies were made, debts settled, and calves counted into the next year's stock. In between these peak periods, scribes worked on other accounts, tracking rations for workers, recording deliveries of fodder, or managing inventories of hides, wool, and milk products. While much of the work was repetitive, it was also critical. A missed count could mean shortages later, and shortages could lead to unrest. The invisible power. Though scribes rarely wielded political power directly, their records underpinned the functioning of both palace and temple. A ruler's orders meant little without the scribal system to track their execution. A temple's wealth could not be demonstrated without written proof. And yet, despite their importance, scribes were often invisible in the historical record, known only by the impressions they left in clay, the neat columns of numbers, and the brief notes of names and quantities. Their work was not celebrated in poetry or monumental inscriptions, but without it, the city's complex economy would have faltered. By holding together the overlapping obligations of temple, palace, and private trade, the scribe maintained a delicate balance, one that could be easily upset by political change, famine, or the loss of trust in the system. And in the centuries ahead, that balance would be tested as empires rose, fell, and reshaped the administrative world the scribes had built. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, the role of the Mesopotamian scribe was as entrenched as the city walls themselves. His marks on clay were the threads binding together the vast web of temple estates, palace demands, and private obligations. But just as herds wander when fences fall, the scribal world was never immune to the disruptions of war, famine, and political change. The Akkadian shadow. The rise of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon in the 24th century BCE had already shown how a single conquering power could reorder the duties of local scribes. Under Akkadian rule, scribes were often required to record not just local temple or palace accounts, but also the taxes and tribute owed to the imperial center. Livestock tallies that once went no farther than a city's central archive now had to be duplicated for messengers bound for Akkad. For some scribes, this meant promotion. Imperial scribal offices offered higher status and access to broader networks. For others, it meant tighter oversight and the loss of local autonomy in how records were kept. In either case, the once purely local cow counts became part of an empire-wide system. When kings change, records change. With every shift in political power, scribes had to adapt their formats and protocols. One king might prefer highly detailed accounts of each individual animal, noting age, sex, and condition. Another might be satisfied with a single bulk total. The cylinder seals that validated transactions often had to be replaced when new rulers came to power, rendering earlier seals obsolete for official purposes. These changes could cause administrative headaches. Imagine dozens of tablets, perfectly accurate by last year's standards, suddenly deemed incomplete because the new king required a different notation for calves versus yearlings. The scribes did not have the luxury of resisting. They relearned, relabeled, and reissued as necessary. Famine and disease in the herds. Economic order could be disrupted by nature as easily as by politics. Droughts could wither grazing land, forcing the slaughter or sale of cattle earlier than planned. Disease outbreaks in the herds were equally devastating, reducing numbers so sharply that even the most creative accounting could not disguise the shortfall. In such crises, the scribe's role became both more urgent and more precarious. Urgent, because accurate records of remaining resources determine how rations would be allocated. Precarious, because accusations of mismanagement could fall on those keeping the tallies, especially if shortages provoked unrest. From clay to papyrus. By the early 1st millennium BCE, in parts of Mesopotamia under Assyrian and later Babylonian control, papyrus and parchment began to supplement clay tablets for some records. While clay remained favored for permanent archives, lighter writing materials made it easier to carry records between cities. For the traditional scribe, this shift was both a convenience and a cultural adjustment. Clay had weight, durability, and the visual authority of permanence. Papyrus was faster and easier to use, but more vulnerable to decay and loss. Some scribes maintained both systems, recording final accounts in clay for the archives, but using papyrus for day-to-day tallies. The quiet decline. As political control in Mesopotamia became more centralized under large empires, many local scribal offices lost some of their independence. The counting of temple cattle was folded into broader provincial bureaucracies. Fewer scribes specialized solely in livestock management. Their duties expanded to cover taxes, military provisioning, and legal records. The meticulous cow counts that had once been a core of urban administration became just one line among many in a provincial ledger. Yet, in smaller cities and rural temples, the old system persisted, a reminder of earlier centuries when the temple herd was the most tangible measure of a community's wealth. The last tablets. The final traces of the cattle counting scribes are found in fragmented tablets from the Persian period, still using the same cuneiform signs their predecessors had impressed on clay 2 millennia earlier. These last records show that while the scope of their work had diminished, the precision remained. Even in the face of empire, the habit of exact accounting endured. Eventually, the language of the scribes shifted, and the tools changed, but the function recording, verifying, and preserving the memory of transactions survived in other forms. The Mesopotamian scribe's craft became the ancestor of later clerks, accountants, and bureaucrats, whose ledgers, registers, and spreadsheets carry the same quiet authority as those ancient clay tablets. A legacy in numbers. The scribes who counted cows may not have thought of themselves as shaping history. Yet without them, the grand projects of Mesopotamian civilization, the building of temples, the provisioning of armies, the maintenance of trade would have been impossible. Their work reminds us that empires are not sustained only by kings and generals, but by the steady hands of those who keep the numbers straight. And it leaves an enduring question. When future historians look back on our own records, will they see the grand events first or the quiet, precise entries that kept the whole system from collapsing? Story 6. The mill that never stopped. Water-powered grain grinding in medieval France. If you had walked along the banks of a modest river in rural France around the year 1250, you might have heard the low, rhythmic rumble of a mill wheel turning. It was not the sharp clang of a blacksmith's hammer or the clamor of a market square, but a steady, almost hypnotic sound. Wood creaking, water splashing, stone grinding against stone. This was the sound of the village watermill at work, a machine whose operation was so continuous, so woven into daily life, that it became almost invisible. For most of medieval Europe, bread was the foundation of the diet. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats had to be ground into flour before they could be baked. Hand-milling grain was slow, backbreaking work. The arrival and spread of water-powered mills in the Middle Ages transformed this process, turning hours of labor into minutes and freeing people for other tasks. But behind this seemingly simple convenience lay an entire system of construction, maintenance, and regulation. The mill's place in the village. In many villages, the mill was not privately owned, it was controlled by the local lord, who had the legal right to compel his tenants to use it. This banal mill was part of the feudal system. Peasants brought their grain to be ground and paid a portion of it as a fee, known as a multure. The lord took his share, and the miller took another for his labor. The arrangement meant that the mill was both an economic engine and a point of control. If the mill stopped, bread supplies faltered, and if disputes arose over fees or fairness, they could quickly grow into larger tensions between lord and tenants. Building the mill. A medieval watermill was a complex piece of engineering. First came the mill race, a channel dug to divert part of the river's flow toward the mill wheel. The wheel itself could be either undershot, with water passing beneath it, or overshot, with water pouring over the top, depending on the river's slope and flow. Inside the mill, the wheel's rotation turned a vertical shaft, which in turn drove the millstones. These massive circular stones, one fixed and one rotating, ground the grain between them. The stones were carved with grooves to cut and crush the grain efficiently. Dressing was skilled work, requiring specialized tools and an understanding of how the grooves guided grain and air through the stones. The miller's skills. The miller's job was part mechanic, part craftsman, and part negotiator. He had to adjust the gap between the stones for different grains, control the flow of water to keep the wheel turning steadily, and listen for changes in the mill's sound that might signal trouble. Too tight a gap, and the flour could burn. Too loose, and the grain would not be properly ground. Milling was not a clean job. Flour dust coated every surface, working its way into clothes, hair, and lungs. The miller worked in a constant haze of it, his ears attuned to the pitch of the grinding stones and the creak of the wheel. The mill as a community hub. While the miller worked, villagers came and went with their sacks of grain. Waiting for their turn, they traded news, discussed weather and crops, and sometimes argued over whose grain was next in line. The mill thus became a social space as well as a workplace, one of the few places where people from across the parish regularly met. The miller himself often occupied a curious social position. As an essential figure, he could earn a decent living, but his role in collecting fees on behalf of the Lord sometimes made him unpopular. Stories and proverbs across Europe depict millers as cunning or dishonest, whether fairly or not. Seasonal patterns. The mill's work followed the agricultural cycle. After the autumn harvest, the mill ran almost constantly as villagers brought in their grain for storage as flour. Winter brought a slower pace, but the mill still operated whenever bread supplies needed replenishing. Spring sowing was a quieter time, but the mill picked up again with the early summer harvests of barley and rye. Heavy rains could flood the mill race, damaging the wheel or halting work until the water receded. In dry seasons, the reduced river flow could slow the wheel or stop it entirely, forcing villagers to revert to hand grinding until the water returned. By the mid-13th century, watermills like this one dotted the rivers and streams of France, their steady labor as integral to rural life as the fields and flocks. Yet the apparent simplicity of turning grain into flour concealed a delicate balance of technology, environment, and social obligation, one that could be easily upset by changes in climate, politics, or the economics of the feudal system. The watermill was more than a piece of machinery. It was a legal and economic institution woven tightly into the fabric of medieval French society. To understand its quiet but enduring influence, you have to look beyond the grinding stones to the parchments and seals, the obligations and fines, and the subtle ways in which a river's current could carry both flour and authority. Banal rights in the law of the mill. Under the feudal system, many mills were banal mills, meaning that the lord who owned them held an exclusive right often granted by royal charter to compel his tenants to grind their grain there. Tenants could not legally take their grain to another mill or grind it at home without paying a fine, sometimes called a droit de mainmort or amende. This right was a valuable source of revenue. The multure, the portion of grain taken as payment, could be as high as 1/16 or even 1/12 of the grain brought in. That fraction, multiplied by the output of an entire village or estate, provided the lord and the miller with steady income. Regulations on operation. The operation of a mill was regulated both by custom and by formal law. The lord or his steward might set the hours when the mill could run, the priority order for grinding during peak times, and even the exact measure of the multure. Some lords required the miller to post a measure, a wooden or metal, standard for the fee so that customers could verify they were not being overcharged. Seasonal rules also applied. During Lent, for example, some regions required that the millstones be cleaned to prevent contamination of flour with animal fats from previous grinding jobs. The miller's balancing act. The miller occupied a delicate position. He was the face of the mill to the tenants, collecting the multure and enforcing the lord's rights. This made him an agent of authority and a potential target of resentment. A miller who took too much flour, or who seemed to favor certain families, could quickly become the subject of whispered complaints in the village and petitions to the lord. Yet millers could also wield quiet influence. By controlling the order in which grain was processed, they could give priority to those in urgent need earning favors, forging alliances, or smoothing over disputes. In times of scarcity, such discretion could make the difference between hunger and survival. Disputes over water. A mill's lifeblood was its water supply, and control over that water often sparked disputes. If a new mill was built upstream, it could divert enough flow to slow the wheel downstream. Farmers who relied on the river for irrigation might complain that the mill race took too much water during dry months. In some cases, entire villages went to court over the right to a share of a river's current. Written agreements sometimes specified the minimum flow that had to pass the mill before it could divert water into its race. Enforcement, however, was another matter, especially when rainfall varied from year to year. Inspection and maintenance. Lords or their stewards inspected mills regularly. They checked the wheel, the stones, and the sluices to ensure they were in good repair. A broken wheel or a cracked millstone could halt grinding for weeks, leading to lost income and, in extreme cases, fines against the miller for negligence. The miller, in turn, depended on skilled carpenters, stonemasons, and blacksmiths for repairs. These tradesmen were often paid partly in grain from the multure, further embedding the mill into the local economy. A quiet source of wealth. While the mill's grinding seemed mundane, the flow of grain through its doors represented a steady, reliable income stream for the lord. In some accounts, a single well-placed mill could yield more revenue than a vineyard or pasture. It also provided leverage. A tenant in arrears on rent might be forced to surrender grain directly at the mill, ensuring the lord's cut was taken before any reached the tenant's household. The unchanging rhythm. For the average villager, the rules of the mill were simply part of life. Grain came in sacks, the multure was measured, and flour came out. Complaints might arise, but few dared openly defy the system. Over generations, the sound of the wheel turning became as much a fixture as the ringing of the church bell, a reminder of the constancy of both the natural flow of the river and the social order it supported. Yet nothing in medieval life was immune to change. As the 14th century unfolded, forces far beyond the village, famine, plague, and shifting patterns of trade, would begin to test the durability of this quiet institution. The river would keep flowing, but the world around it was about to become far less predictable. For centuries, the mill's wheel turned almost without pause, grinding grain into flour for bread that sustained medieval France. It was an unbroken rhythm until the mid-14th century, when events beyond the village disrupted even the most constant patterns. The changes that came were slow in some ways, sudden in others, but all left their mark on the future of the watermill. The Black Death and empty villages. When the Black Death arrived in the late 1340s, it struck with terrifying speed. Whole families vanished in weeks, and entire villages were left deserted. For the watermill, the first impact was silence. No grain arrived to be ground, no queue of villagers waited with sacks. The wheel might still have turned, but the stores of grain rotted unclaimed. In areas where only part of the population perished, the reduced demand for milling meant fewer hours of operation. Some millers abandoned their posts entirely, while others took on additional work repairing tools, managing livestock to make up for lost income. Shifts in land ownership. Depopulation also altered the feudal structure that supported the banal mill system. Lords who lost tenants struggled to enforce exclusive milling rights. In some regions, abandoned land was taken over by independent farmers who brought their grain to whichever mill offered the best terms. The fixed multure was no longer as unquestionable as it had been before. Some lords responded by lowering fees to attract more grain. Others leased mills to entrepreneurial millers, who were allowed to keep a larger share of the profits in exchange for maintaining the equipment themselves. Technological adjustments. The late Middle Ages saw gradual but important changes in mill technology. Improvements in waterwheel design increased efficiency, especially in areas where rivers ran low in summer. The introduction of iron components for gears and axles reduced wear and made repairs more durable. Miller's craft also adapted to finer flour production. Urban bakeries, serving wealthier clients, demanded whiter flour, which required more careful milling and sometimes additional passes through the stones. Rural mills that could meet these standards found lucrative new markets. Competition from windmills. From the 12th century onward, windmills began appearing in parts of France, first in the drier regions where rivers were unreliable, then gradually spreading inland. By the 15th century, windmills competed with watermills for grain. Wind power offered independence from rivers and seasonal droughts, though it was at the mercy of weather in a different way. Still, watermills retained advantages in areas with steady rivers. They could operate almost continuously, day and night, with no need to wait for favorable wind. Many villages kept both, ensuring that grain could be processed regardless of weather. The mill in early modern France. By the 16th century, some of the strictest feudal milling rights had softened. In market towns, mills became more commercial enterprises, serving a wider range of clients for negotiated fees. Yet in rural parishes, the old banal system persisted well into the early modern period. The wheel's sound remained familiar and the work was still seasonal, busy after harvest, quieter in the dead of winter. The social role of the mill, part workplace, part gathering spot, also endured, though by now it stood in a more fluid economic landscape. Enduring legacy. The medieval watermill's impact was larger than its modest appearance suggested. It freed rural labor from the slow work of hand grinding, supported the feudal economy, and tied villages to their rivers in ways both practical and symbolic. Even as new power sources emerged, steam in the 18th century, electricity in the 19th, the image of the water wheel persisted as a symbol of continuity. Some medieval mills still stand today, their wheels restored for tourists or adapted to generate small amounts of hydroelectric power. Others survive only as ruins, the river long since finding a new course. But in the quiet turning of a wheel, there is an echo of centuries when its sound marked the heartbeat of the countryside. And so the question lingers. When a machine becomes so common that people stop noticing it, is that the height of its success or the first step toward its disappearance? Story 7. Ceramic and Silence, the daily life of a Tang Dynasty kiln. If you stood on the outskirts of a small Tang Dynasty town around the year 800 CE, you might notice a low rise of earth stained with soot, a few timber sheds, and a narrow plume of smoke curling into the morning air. You might not hear much, just the muted scrape of a potter's tool against clay, the muffled conversation of apprentices, or the soft whoosh of a kiln's breath. Yet here, in the quiet hum of work, some of the most enduring objects of Chinese history were taking shape. The Tang context. The Tang Dynasty, 618–907 CE, presided over one of the most prosperous and cosmopolitan eras in Chinese history. The Silk Road was bustling. Cities like Chang'an were magnets for traders, scholars, and artisans, and ceramics ranging from humble cooking pots to fine glazed wares were both everyday necessities and valuable exports. The kilns of this period varied in size and prestige. Some produced large batches of plain, utilitarian vessels for local markets. Others, often under imperial or elite patronage, experimented with glazes, decorative techniques, and distinctive shapes that would later become symbols of Tang artistry. The layout of a kiln site. A Tang kiln site was more than a single furnace. It was a small production complex, typically arranged around 3 core spaces. Clay preparation area. Here, workers kneaded and cleaned raw clay, removing stones and organic matter. Clay might be sourced from local riverbanks or traded from regions known for fine material. Shaping and drying sheds. Potters shaped vessels by hand or on a slow wheel, then set them aside under shelter to dry to a leather-hard state before firing. The kiln structure, the heart of the operation, often a long, narrow, uphill tunnel built into a slope, a dragon kiln, or a smaller dome-shaped furnace for finer work. The process from earth to vessel. The transformation from raw clay to finished ceramic required careful timing and patience. Wedging the clay, the potter kneaded the clay to an even consistency, working out air bubbles that could cause explosions during firing. Forming, shapes ranged from bowls, jars, and ewers to small figurines and roof tiles. The potter's wheel, already well established in China for centuries, was slow turning and powered by the potter's own hands or feet. Trimming and decorating, some wares were left plain, others were carved, stamped, or molded with patterns. For more refined pieces, potters might apply a slip liquid clay or an early glaze. Drying, pieces were dried slowly to prevent warping or cracking, especially in humid weather. This could take days or even weeks. Glazes and colors. The Tang period is famous for its Sankai, 3 colors. Glazes green, amber, and creamy white used especially for tomb figurines and decorative wares. These lead-based glazes melted at relatively low temperatures, allowing vibrant colors but requiring careful firing to avoid running or pooling. At smaller kilns, simpler ash glazes or unglazed pottery dominated, their tones determined by the local clay's minerals and the firing atmosphere oxidizing for brighter colors, reducing for darker, richer tones. Life around the kiln. The kiln yard was a place of slow, steady rhythms. Apprentices carried armloads of fuel pine, bamboo, or straw while senior potters adjusted kiln vents. Children sometimes helped prepare clay or fetched water. Meals were simple: rice or millet, vegetables, maybe dried fish. Work was dictated by the weather. Too much rain slowed drying, strong winds could affect firing temperatures. Unlike the bustle of city markets, a kiln site often felt isolated. Firing days were especially intense once the kiln was lit. It had to be tended continuously for hours or even days, with workers taking shifts to feed the flames. The sound and silences. For much of the day, there was more silence than speech. The work demanded concentration, and the noise of shaping clay or stoking the kiln was soft compared to other crafts. The loudest moment came at the end of a firing, when the kiln was opened and workers carefully removed the cooled wares, hopping for perfect surfaces and unwarped shapes. At first glance, this was just one of countless small industries in Tang, China. But over centuries, these quiet kilns would help define the material culture of their time, and their products, whether plain or ornate, would travel far beyond their villages, carried along the trade routes of Asia and beyond. A Tang dynasty kiln site was never just a place to make pots. It was part of an intricate network of supply, labor, and regulation that tied rural hillsides to imperial courts, bustling markets, and far-off caravans on the Silk Road. While the fire in the kiln was the visible heart of the process, the lifeblood was a system of relationships and obligations that reached far beyond the furnace's walls. Workforce and roles. A typical kiln operation employed a mix of skilled and unskilled labor. Master potter, the senior artisan, often responsible for both design and overseeing production. His knowledge of clay preparation, glaze chemistry, and kiln operation was the result of decades of experience. Assistants, these journeyman potters helped with shaping, decorating, and loading the kiln. Apprentices, often boys from nearby villages, they fetched water, kneaded clay, and carried fuel. A good apprentice could rise in skill over the years, eventually starting his own kiln. Laborers, non-specialized workers who quarried clay, cut wood, or transported finished wares to market. In some larger kiln complexes, certain workers specialized entirely in glaze production or mold carving, ensuring consistency across large batches. Ownership and patronage. Kilns fell under different types of control. Private kilns, owned by artisans or merchant families, who sold their wares to local buyers. Official kilns operated under imperial or regional government patronage, producing high-quality goods for the court or as diplomatic gifts. Monastic kilns linked to Buddhist monasteries, which sometimes sponsored production for temple use or sale to pilgrims. Patronage mattered. Official kilns had access to better materials, more skilled labor, and greater prestige, but they also faced stricter quality standards and tighter regulation. Trade networks. Ceramics from even modest Tang kilns could travel far. A village jar might end up in the kitchen of a nearby town, while fine Sankai figurines could be loaded onto camel caravans bound for Samarkand. Tang merchants also shipped ceramics by sea, with ports along the southeastern coast sending glazed wares to Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Merchants typically bought in bulk, paying in copper cash, grain, or cloth. Finished wares were wrapped in straw and packed into baskets or crates for transport. Breakage was a constant risk. Long journeys on bumpy roads or rough seas could shatter delicate pieces before they reached their buyers. Taxes and regulation. The Tang state kept a watchful eye on production and trade. Pottery could be taxed at multiple stages on the raw clay, on the finished goods leaving the kiln, or at checkpoints along trade routes. Some regions required kiln owners to register their operations and report output figures, partly to ensure tax compliance, partly to regulate quality. Official kilns might be required to deliver a quota of goods directly to government warehouses, often in lieu of some taxes. These quotas could be a source of pressure during years when fuel or clay supplies were low. Fuel and environmental limits. A kiln was only as productive as its fuel supply allowed. Woodcutters were hired to bring pine, bamboo, or other combustibles, and nearby hills could be stripped bare if demand for firing grew too high. In some provinces, local officials imposed seasonal limits on wood cutting to protect watersheds and maintain the supply. When wood became scarce, kiln operators sometimes turned to straw, reeds, or agricultural chaff for firing materials that burned faster and required more careful stoking to keep the kiln hot enough. Economic cycles. The kiln's fortunes rose and fell with the broader economy. In years of good harvests and stable governance, demand for both utilitarian wares and decorative items increased. In years of famine, drought, or political unrest, fewer people bought ceramics beyond the most basic household needs. A master potter might diversify production, switching from luxury glazes to plain storage jars to keep the business afloat. The invisible connections. Standing in the quiet of a Tang kiln yard, you might not guess that its output was part of an economic web stretching across continents. Yet each jar, plate, or figurine was shaped not only by the hands of the potter, but by the push and pull of markets, the edicts of governors, and the flow of goods and ideas across the empire. Still, the kiln was a fragile enterprise. A single mishap, a collapsed firing, a flood that ruined stored clay, a caravan raid could undo months of work. And beyond these local risks, history itself was moving toward changes that would alter the very landscape of Chinese ceramics. By the mid-9th century, the Tang dynasty was still an empire of wealth and trade, but it was also entering a period of instability. For the potters who had labored for decades in the quiet kilns of the countryside, these shifting tides brought both opportunity and uncertainty. Technological advances. The Tang period had already seen great leaps in ceramic technology, refined clays, new glaze formulas, and the use of long, sloped dragon kilns capable of firing thousands of pieces in one cycle. But in its later years, new developments hinted at the changes to come. Higher firing temperatures, experiments with stoneware and early porcelain began to emerge, particularly in the kilns of northern China. These harder, denser ceramics could hold water without glaze, and their surfaces offered new possibilities for decoration. Improved glaze chemistry. Potters tested combinations of mineral oxides to expand beyond Sankei colors, edging toward the celadons and blue and white wares that would dominate later dynasties. Standardization of forms. Official kilns increasingly used molds to create consistent shapes for mass production, particularly for trade goods. Cultural shifts. While Sankei wares remained popular for tomb figurines and decorative vessels, tastes at court and among wealthy patrons began to shift toward subtler forms, monochrome glazes, elegant silhouettes, and wares inspired by Buddhist aesthetics. These changes influenced kiln output, with some workshops pivoting to meet new preferences, while others continued making older styles for regional markets. Buddhist monasteries themselves became significant patrons, commissioning offering bowls, incense burners, and temple tiles. The visual language of these pieces, lotus motifs, cloud patterns blended seamlessly into the evolving artistic climate. Economic and political disruptions. The Tang capital of Chang'an suffered during political upheavals such as the Huang Kao Rebellion, 874–884 CE, which disrupted trade routes and reduced demand for luxury goods. Kiln operators far from the front lines still felt the effects. Fewer merchants arrived, and tax collectors grew more aggressive as the state sought revenue. Some kiln sites were abandoned entirely during these years, their partially built vessels left to weather in the open. Others adapted by focusing on durable, functional goods for local use rather than risky long-distance trade. The end of the Tang and the afterlife of the kiln. When the Tang dynasty collapsed in 907 CE, many official kilns lost their state patronage overnight. Some masters sought new sponsors among the rising regional powers of the Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms period. Others simply continued as before, serving local needs in relative obscurity. Yet the technological and artistic groundwork laid in Tang kilns would echo through centuries of Chinese ceramics. Techniques perfected here: multi-chambered dragon kilns, Sankei glazing, mass-molded figurines would influence Song celadons, Yuan blue and white porcelain, and even Ming export wares. The archaeological legacy. Today, the remnants of Tang kilns tell their story in shards and ash layers. Archaeologists uncover piles of misfired pots, collapsed kiln walls, and waste pits full of broken glaze tests. Each fragment offers clues about firing temperatures, glaze recipes, and the scale of production. Some kiln sites have been reconstructed as museums, where visitors can see replicas of the Great Dragon kilns, their long tunnels stretching up a hillside, once alive with heat and light. A long silence. When the fire finally went out in a Tang kiln, the quiet returned. Grass grew over the ash, the sheds fell in, and the riverbank clay hardened untouched. Yet the silence was not the end. Tang ceramics, whether a humble cooking pot or a dazzling Sankei horse, had already set out on their journeys, carrying the memory of that quiet yard to kitchens, markets, and palaces far beyond the reach of the potter's wheel. And so one wonders, was the kiln's greatest achievement its finest masterpiece, or was it the steady, anonymous work that made the world's tables, temples, and tombs just a little more beautiful?